Lesson 35, the perfect, pluperfect, and a future perfect indicative passive. Review of indicative, active, and passive. Hi everybody, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today is lesson 35, and we are on page 106. And this particular lesson, that is the lecture for this lesson, is a special one because we have a special guest speaker, a guest teacher here in Lenny's Latin class, and that is my colleague, Michelle, who, unlike me, is a professional Latin teacher. So Michelle will be taking you through lots of passive verbs today, showing you how all those work. So take it away, Michelle.
Hello, my name is Michelle, and I am going to be doing lesson 35 with you today. Lesson 35 is on the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect indicative passive, and a review of indicative, active, and passive. In Latin, when we are talking about the grammar of verbs, and specifically organizing the tenses and voices of verbs, we have a very specific way that we organize them. So the first way is by tense. There are 6 tenses in Latin, at least for the indicative, and that's present, imperfect, future, perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect. And we usually do them in that order. And we call the first half of those the present system. So the present system of tenses includes present tense, future tense, and imperfect tense. Although usually we do it in the other order. We do present, then imperfect, then future, if we're going to sort of write out a long chart. And then the last 3, perfect tense, pluperfect tense, and future perfect tense, we call all of those together the perfect system. And the way I like to think about it is the perfect system includes all of the perfect tenses, the tenses that have the word perfect in them, and that doesn't include the imperfect because the imperfect is imperfect. It's not perfect. We've already done the passive and the active for the present system, and you've already done the active for the perfect system. And today we are going to be talking about the passive voice for the perfect system. So remember, when I'm talking about present and perfect and all of these other tenses, that has to do with time. So when is the verb happening? Is it happening right now? I am running, that's present tense. Was it happening over the course of time in the past? I was running, right? That's imperfect. Voice, on the other hand, has to do with who is doing the action, whether it's the subject or an agent in the sentence. So in active voice, the subject does the verb, right? I eat the apple. In the passive voice, the verb happens to the subject, so you would make the apple the subject. The apple is eaten by me. So in English, the apple is the subject of the sentence, even though the apple's not doing the eating. So today we're going to talk about the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect tenses of the passive voice. So your book says, formation of passive perfect tenses. In the passive voice, the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect are formed by combining respectively the present, imperfect, and future of sum with the perfect participle of the given verb. So let's stop there. So in the perfect system, in the passive voice, these are going to be 2-word verbs. So every other verb you've had so far is 1 word. Things like laudo, I praise, or laudavi, I praised, laudator, he is praised. All of those are 1 word in Latin. In the perfect passive system, they are 2 words. So the first word is always going to be the perfect passive participle. So that is a form of the 4th principal part. So if you're using the verb laudo, right, the principal parts are laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatum, or laudatus, depending on what dictionary you're using. So the first word is going to be laudatus, or some form of laudatus. The participle, right, laudatus, behaves like an adjective because it's a participle. Participles are verbs that behave like adjectives. So that us at the end can change depending on the case, number, and gender of the subject. So the first word in any passive perfect system verb is going to be your fourth principal part, your perfect passive participle. Then the second word is going to be a form of sum, which is the verb to be. It's going to be a form of the Latin verb to be. So the principal parts of that are sum, esse, fui, futurus. And you are going to pick which form of to be based on a couple of factors. The most obvious factor is you're going to pick it based on the person and number of the verb. So if you want to have a first person singular verb, you're going to use the first person singular form of to be, sum. So we're starting off talking about the perfect tense. Coming back to the book, it says, combining respectively the present, imperfect, and future of sum with the perfect participle of the given verb. So perfect, laudatus sum. Pluperfect, laudatus eram. Future perfect, laudatus ero. So what that means is for the perfect tense, passive, for a verb, the first word is going to be the fourth principal part, and the second word is going to be, you have one of 6 options: sum, est, sumus, estis, and sunt. So those are the present tense forms of to be. So that can get a little confusing because you are taking a present tense verb, the form of to be, and that's going to combine, not into one word, it's a 2-word verb, but combine with the perfect passive participle of the verb you're actually trying to make to form the perfect passive verb. So for instance, we have laudatus sum, laudatus es, laudatus est, laudati sumus, laudati estis, laudati sunt. I'm going to come back in a second on why laudatus changes to laudati. So if you look at sort of the left side of this chart, number 284, it is the perfect indicative passive. So we start off with I have been praised. So this is the perfect tense. You can say have been verbed or I was verbed. Either one is fine. So I have been praised. That would be laudatus sum. And then the second person singular is laudatus es. And that would be you have been praised. Okay, laudatus est would be he, she, or it has been praised. And then we go over to the plural column. Laudati sumus, we have been praised. Laudati estis, y'all have been praised. And laudati sunt, they have been praised. I will point out now that the ending for laudatus changes, like I mentioned before, because laudatus is a participle. It is a verbal adjective. It's a verb that acts like an adjective, and so it has adjectival endings. It has endings that agree with whatever noun it's describing. And in this situation, the quote-unquote noun that it's describing, whether or not there is a noun in the sentence, is the subject of the sentence. So if you have laudatus sum, the subject is I, right? Because it's first person singular, because sum is first person singular. And so that ending for laudatus needs to agree with the I. So in this chart, we are assuming that the I or the you or the he is masculine because we have the us ending. So on the right side, everything is plural because it's the plural part of the chart. So of course, sumus, estis, and sunt are plural, but you also need to change the participle, the fourth principal part, that first word in the verb, to be plural as well, to agree with the subject. So we've changed laudatus to laudati. So we're assuming that the we, the y'all, or the they are masculine plural. So just to recap, we are doing all of this if you are trying to form a perfect tense, indicative, passive verb. So all the verbs we're talking about so far are going to be 2-word verbs. So the perfect tense, passive voice, indicative verbs are always going to be 2 words. And the first word is the fourth principal part, otherwise known as the perfect passive participle. And the second word is going to be a form of to be. And for the perfect tense, it's going to be a present tense form of to be. So sum es est, sumus estis, sunt. And number 283 gives us the rest of the information about what we do for the pluperfect and the future perfect, but we can come back to that in a minute. I'm just going to read the last sentence in section 283. It says, these tenses, consisting of two words, are called compound tenses. Other tenses consisting of one word may be called simple tenses. So because it has two words instead of one, we call it a compound tense. So the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect passive are compound tenses. So we have a couple examples just for the perfect tense in number 284. So first we have monitus sum. So we would translate that as I, since it's sum, that's first person singular, and then it's sum es est, it's the present tense form of to be, so it must be part of a perfect tense verb. So I have, and then it's passive, so the verb is happening to the subject, so I have been, and then monitus comes from the verb that means to advise. So monitus sum means I have been advised. And if we wanted to write out the whole chart, it would go monitus sum, I have been advised. Monitus es, you have been advised. Monitus est, he, she, or it has been advised. Moniti sumus, we have been advised. Moniti estis, y'all have been advised. And moniti sunt, they have been advised. So let me point out a couple things about the chart I just said. First, notice that I changed moniti, right, monitus to moniti from the singular to the plural because that perfect passive participle needs to change its ending depending on whether it's singular or plural. I said monitus est means he, she, or it has been advised, but that's not actually true. Monitus est can only really mean he has been advised, because monitus is a masculine ending. So if you wanted to say she has been advised, remember, the fourth principal part, the perfect passive participle, acts like an adjective, so it can use any first or second declension endings. So if you wanted to say she has been advised, you would really need the nominative singular feminine ending, the letter A. So you would say monita est, she has been advised. And if you want to keep going with that and have a feminine subject the entire time, you would have monita sum, monita es, monita est, and then in the second column, instead of using the letter I as your ending, you would need AE, because that is the feminine nominative plural ending. So monitai sumus, monitai estis, monitai sunt. Our next example is rectus sum, which comes from regere, to rule. So our first verb in the perfect indicative passive chart would be rectus sum. I, since sum is first person singular, have, since it's perfect tense. I have been, since it's passive, it's happening to the subject, and then ruled, so regere means to rule. So rectus sum, I have been ruled. Rectus es, again, two words because it's a compound tense. Rectus es would be you have been ruled. Then rectus est would be he has been ruled. Or if you wanted to do she has been ruled, you could say recta est. Or if you wanted to say it has been ruled, you could say rectum est, from the neuter nominative singular ending. And then in the plural, we need some sort of nominative plural ending. So recti sumus would be we have been ruled, assuming we is masculine plural, right? A group of men or a co-ed group. Recti estis would be y'all have been ruled. And then recti sunt would be they have been ruled. Our next example is captus sum, which comes from the verb to take or to seize, capio capere, capi captum. So captus sum would be I have been taken. So I, because it's first person singular, and then it's perfect tense, so I have. And then been tells us that it's happening to the subject because it's passive. So I have been verbed, and the verb is taken. I have been taken. We can also do all of these in the more simple perfect, the more simple past way. I was taken, or I was ruled, or I was advised. So I'll do that for this one. So coptus sum would be I was taken. Coptus est would be you were taken. Coptus est would be he, she, or it was taken. Of course, changing that us depending on what gender the subject is. And then copti sumus would be we were taken. Copti estis, y'all were taken. And copti sunt, they were taken. And then finally, our last example is auditus sum from the Latin verb audio, audire, audivi, auditum. So auditus sum would be I was heard. Auditus es, you were heard. Auditus est, he, she, or it was heard. Auditi sumus, we were heard. Auditi estis, y'all were heard. And auditi sunt, they were heard. Now, interestingly, this book gave you all of these verbs for a reason, and the reason is that we have an example from each conjugation. So laudare is first conjugation, monere is second conjugation, regere is third conjugation, capere is third IO, and audire is fourth. And the most important thing to take away from this is that conjugation has no bearing on the way you form these verbs. So in other tenses you've done, sometimes the conjugation really matters. For example, you will have a different vowel in between the root and the personal ending in the present tense, depending on what conjugation it is. So a first conjugation verb, laudare, would have an A vowel. Laudat means he praises, whereas audire, a fourth conjugation verb, uses the I vowel, so audit. Another example where conjugation really matters is the future tense, because in the future tense you actually have a totally different set of endings depending on the conjugation. So first and second conjugation use bo, bis, bit as their future tense endings, whereas third IO, and fourth conjugation use s, et. But here, there is no change. Conjugation does not matter at all for forming the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect passive tenses. But we have an example of all of them just so you can see. So referring back to section 283, we've done the perfect tense, passive, and now we are going to do the pluperfect. So it tells us that these verbs, these compound tense verbs, are formed by combining the forms of to be with the perfect passive participle. So for the perfect tense, we used sum es est, the present tense of the verb to be. And for the pluperfect tense, we are going to use the imperfect form of to be. So to form the pluperfect passive verb, you are going to take the perfect passive participle, the fourth principal part, and then your next word is going to be one of 6 options. Eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratus, erant. Now, I actually think this is super easy to remember because that set of words is the pluperfect endings in the active voice. So this time, you just take the pluperfect endings, and instead of treating them like endings, you treat them like their own little word. So you take the first word, the fourth principal part, and then the second word is going to be your pluperfect ending. Now, in this situation, it's not actually a pluperfect ending. It is the imperfect form of to be, but those 2 sets of words or sets of letters are identical. In the active voice, ending a verb with eram makes it pluperfect. In the passive voice, having eram after a fourth principal part makes it pluperfect. So, our first example uses laudare to praise, and our first word is laudatus eram. So that first person singular is going to be I. because it's first person singular. And then it's pluperfect, so you use the word had to translate it. And then remember, we're still working in the passive voice. So the verb is happening to the subject. So I am verbed, or I was verbed. And here it's pluperfect. I had been verbed, and the verb is praise. So laudatus eram, I had been praised. And then laudatus eras, you had been praised. Laudatus erat, he, she, or it had been praised. Laudati eramus, we had been praised. Laudati eratus, y'all had been praised. And laudati erant, they had been praised. And again, just like I talked about before, everything still stands when it comes to the first word of this verb being a participle, being a verbal adjective. So you change that ending to whatever nominative singular or nominative plural ending matches your subject. So if you have a subject that is feminine, you would do laudata eram, laudata eras, laudata erat, laudatai eramus, laudatai eratus, laudatai erant. You could even do a neuter subject. So if you were talking about, let's say, the temple had been praised. If you wanted to say the temple had been praised, you'd say templum, which is a neuter noun, laudatum erat. So laudatum agrees with templum. And then if you wanted to make it plural, the temples had been praised, you would use the neuter plural nominative ending, which is the letter A. So you would say templa laudata erant. So that can get a little confusing because A is both a neuter plural ending and a feminine singular ending. So you have to look at all pieces of the verb to know what's going on. So if you just saw laudata on its own, you actually wouldn't know if it's talking about a feminine singular thing or a neuter plural thing. But if you look at the second word, if it's a singular verb, right, laudata eram obviously is singular because eram is singular. Whereas if you saw laudata erant, erant is plural. So laudata, that A must be a neuter plural ending. Our next example is from the verb monere, to advise or to warn. And it goes monitus eram. So we start off with the first person singular, I. And then it's pluperfect. So we use the word had. And then it's passive. So it's happening to me. I had been advised. So monitus eram, I had been advised. And then the second person singular would be monitus eras, you had been advised. So we're going to keep the first word always is going to be the perfect passive participle, which is the fourth principal part. And that second word for the pluperfect tense is going to be the imperfect form of to be, eram, eras, erat. So we have monitus eras, you had been advised. Monitus erat, he, she, or it had been advised. Moniti eramus, we had been advised. Moniti eratus, y'all had been advised. And third person plural, moniti erant, they had been advised. Our next example is a third conjugation verb, regere. So we're using the same examples for all of the tenses just to keep it regular. So we start off with the first person singular, rectus eram, I had been ruled. Then the second person singular, rectus eras, you had been ruled. Then the third person singular, rectus erat, he, she, or it had been ruled. Then the first person plural, recti eramus, we had been ruled. Then the second person plural, recti eratus, y'all had been ruled. And finally, the third person plural, recti erant, they had been ruled. And again, I'm sort of sticking to what is written in the book, keeping everything masculine, which is usually the standard, especially in older books, to just sort of have everything be masculine, and then we learn about the other genders later. So I'm trying to explain that, it's not always rectus erat. because sometimes the subject is feminine or sometimes the subject is neuter. But here it's assuming that the subject is masculine. So even though it says rectus erat, that's why I'm saying he, she, or it had been ruled. Really, it should be he had been ruled, and then I could say recta erat is she had been ruled, and rectum erat would be it had been ruled. Our next example is our third IO verb, copio, capere, capi, coptum. So the first person singular is coptus eram, I had been taken. Then we would have coptus eras, you had been taken. And then coptus erat, he, she, or it had been taken. And then the plural, so first person plural would be copti eramus, we had been taken. Then copti eratis, y'all had been taken. And third person plural would be copti erant, they had been taken. And one more to walk through for the pluperfect tense, we have the fourth conjugation verb, audio, audire, audivi, auditum, to hear. So for the singular, first person singular would be auditus eram, I had been heard, auditus eras, you had been heard, and auditus erat, he, she, or it had been heard. And then for the plural, we'd have first person plural, auditi eramus, we had been heard, auditi eratus, y'all had been heard, and auditi erant, they had been heard. So again, just to reiterate, the pluperfect passive forms of verbs are two words. The first word is the fourth principal part, which is the perfect passive participle. And that ending can change, can have any first or second declension ending, although in the context of these verbs, it's only ever going to be nominative. And then the second word for the pluperfect tense is going to be eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratus, or erant. So it's going to be one of 6 forms of the imperfect form of to be. All right, one more tense to talk about in the perfect system, and we're talking about the passive voice, and that is the future perfect tense. So in this verb, like all the other ones we've been talking about so far today, the first word is going to be the fourth principal part, the perfect passive participle. And now the second word for the future perfect tense is going to be the future form of the verb to be. It is going to be either ero, eris, erit, erimus, eritus, or erunt. And you may notice that these look strikingly similar to the future perfect endings that you use when it's active. There is one difference, and that difference is the third person plural. So when we were using this combination of letters as a future perfect ending, you saw ero, eris, erit, erimus, eritus, erint. But here, you're going to use erunt, which is a form of the future tense to be. So if you saw these words on their own without the fourth principal part of another verb before it, ero, all by itself, would mean I will be. Eritus would mean y'all will be. So if I wanted to say, like, I will be happy, I would say, ero laita, I will be happy. And if you wanted to say, they will be, all on its own, as its own word, you would use erunt. So here we have erunt, not erint, which was the future perfect ending if it was active. So if you are going to form a future perfect passive verb, you're going to start with the fourth principal part. So our first example comes from laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatum. So we start with laudatus, and then the second word is going to be the future tense form of to be. So laudatus ero. And the way you're going to translate that is you're going to take its first person singular, so you say I, and then your book says shall have, but that's outdated. People don't generally talk like that in English anymore. Usually we say will instead of shall. So I'm going to say will. So future perfect in general, we translate as will have. So the future part is the will, and the perfect part is the have. So I will have, and then it's passive, so it's happening to the subject. I will have been, and what's the verb? The first verb here that we're using is praise, so laudatus ero is I will have been praised. And then if we want to go down the chart, laudatus eris would be second person singular, you will have been praised. Laudatus erit is your third person singular, he, she, or it will have been praised. Laudati erimus is first person plural, we will have been praised. Laudati eritus is second person plural, y'all will have been praised. And finally, laudati erunt is third person plural, they will have been praised. We can look at our other examples now. So a second conjugation verb, although again, remember, conjugation doesn't actually change any of the things you're doing here, but it gives you all the conjugations just so you can practice. So our second conjugation verb that's an example is monere, to advise. So let's treat this one as if it is a feminine subject. So whoever the subject is, whether it's I or we, it's all women this time. So if we wanted to say, I will have been advised, assuming that I am a girl, I would say, monita ero, I will have been advised. And then if I wanted to say, second person singular, you will have been advised, assuming you are a girl, it would be monita eris. If I wanted to say, she will have been advised, I would say, monita erit. If I wanted to say, we will have been advised, assuming that we is me and my girlfriend, I would say monitai erimus. That AE is the feminine plural nominative ending. If I wanted to say y'all will have been advised, assuming y'all are girls, I would say monitai eritus. And then finally, if I wanted to say they will have been advised, assuming that they are women, it would be monitai erunt. Our next example is the verb regere, to rule. Rectus ero, going back to masculine. Rectus ero would mean I will have been ruled. That's first person singular. The second person singular would be rectus eris, you will have been ruled. The third person singular would be rectus erit, he, she, or it will have been ruled. Then the plural, first person plural, would be recti erimus, we will have been ruled. Then recti eritus, y'all will have been ruled. And third person plural would be recti erunt, they will have been ruled. Okay, we have two more examples for the future perfect passive verbs. The next one comes from the verb copio capere, capi coptum, to take. So coptus ero would be I will have, future perfect, been, passive, taken. Coptus eris would be you will have been taken. Coptus erit would be he, she, or it will have been taken. Copti erimus would be we will have been taken. Copti eritus would mean y'all will have been taken. And copti erunt would be they will have been taken. And finally, our last example comes from audio, audire, audivi, auditum, to hear. So our first word is the fourth principal part, auditus. And then our second word is the future form of the verb to be. And those two words together make up the future perfect passive verb. So auditus ero is I will have been heard. Auditus eris is you will have been heard. Auditus erit is he, she, or it will have been heard. Auditi erimus is we will have been heard. Auditi eritus is y'all will have been heard. And auditi erunt is they will have been heard. At the bottom here of section 284, it says, write a synopsis of the modal verbs in the passive voice indicative mood. So that's what I just did for you. I just spelled out all of the options for all of these different tenses. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about a trick that I like to use to remember how to do this, how to do the perfect system passive verbs. And that trick is, I think of these verbs like a little math problem. So the first component of the math problem is the fourth principal part, that perfect passive participle. So that is always going to stay the same. It's always going to be perfect, right? Because it's a perfect passive participle. And then the second word is a form of to be. And remember, the forms of to be you're using are not the perfect, pluperfect, or future perfect forms of to be. They are the present, imperfect, and future. So for the perfect tense, you use the perfect passive participle and the present form of to be. And so I like to think about it as if perfect plus present equals perfect. So the perfect passive participle makes the verb perfect, and then you use the present tense form of to be, and I sort of think of the present tense as a zeroing out tense, right? It's as if you're adding 0 to it. So perfect plus present, I think of as perfect. And then for the pluperfect tense, you have the perfect passive participle and the imperfect form of to be. So what is that math problem? It is perfect plus imperfect. And perfect is in the past, and imperfect is also in the past. So if you have two past tense verb components, that's going to put you even further back in the past, and that's the pluperfect. So perfect plus imperfect equals pluperfect is sort of how I like to think about it. This is not a perfect, no pun intended, way to think about this, but if it's a trick that helps you, then that's great. If this is confusing to you, as I always like to say to my students, when I give little tricks like this, if it helps, awesome. If it's confusing, forget it. And the last one I think maybe is the easiest one to understand, because perfect, you use the perfect passive participle, plus future, you use the future form of to be. Perfect plus future, just switch those words around, is future perfect. So having a perfect component and a future component creates the future perfect passive verb. And you can think about this logically too in the way you translate it. So on its own, a perfect passive participle translates as having been verbed. So you might think that laudatus sum means I am, that's the sum, and then the perfect passive participle having been praised. So I am having been praised can condense down to I was praised, or I have been praised. Same thing with the pluperfect. Laudatus eram. Eram is I was, and laudatus is having been praised. So I was having been praised can condense down to I had been praised. And then finally, laudatus ero. Ero is I will, and then laudatus is having been praised. So I will having been praised, you just take out that ing, right? I will have been praised. And it sort of works out and makes sense logically. So again, the little math problem, if that's confusing, don't worry about it. But if it helps you sort of understand logically why this is happening, then now you have a little trick to help you. If you want to sort of not think about it logically and just sort of straight memorize it, the easiest way to think about it is perfect system passive verbs are 2 words. Unlike every other verb you've learned so far, perfect system passive verbs are 2 words. The first word is a fourth principal part, and the second word is a form of to be. And you use the present form of to be for the perfect tense, the imperfect form of to be for the pluperfect tense, and the future form of to be for the future perfect tense. Next, we have section 285, which tells us about the agreement of the participle, which is something I've actually already talked about a little bit. So it says, the participle agrees with the subject in gender as well as number and case. For a feminine subject, we should have laudata sum, laudatai sumus, etc. For neuter, laudatum est, laudata sunt. So basically, the ending of the participle, that is, the ending of the fourth principal part, needs to agree with the subject, since it's describing the subject, in case, number, and gender. Remember that participles behave like adjectives. They are verbal adjectives, and so they can have adjectival endings. And so if your subject is feminine, so for instance, if I am a woman, and I am saying I was praised, or I have been praised, the adjectival ending of the participle, the fourth principal part, should agree with the subject, should be feminine. And since I am singular, it should also be singular. And since it's always going to describe the subject, or it's always going to describe who's doing the action of that second word in the verb, it's always going to be nominative. So laudata sum is singular, laudatai sumus is plural if the subject's feminine, laudatum est is singular, laudata sunt is plural if it's neuter. So continuing on with section 285. If a verb has two or more subjects of different genders, the participle is masculine if the subject denotes persons, neuter if they denote things, or it may agree with the nearest subject. So I've talked about this a little bit already. If the subject is feminine, it's going to have a feminine ending. If it's masculine, it's going to have a masculine ending. Now, this says if the subjects are persons, it's going to be masculine. So this is almost always true because the subject is most of the time either masculine or talking about a group of men or a co-ed group. And in Latin, you use masculine to describe all of that. So the only time the participle is feminine is when it has an only feminine subject. So only women or only a group of women or only a feminine object. Now, if we are talking about things, and it is not clear what the subject is. So if we are talking about a table, mensa, and we wanted to say the table was thrown, we would say mensa iacta est. We use that a ending to agree with mensa. But if we're just saying a thing was thrown and we don't include the subject, we would use a neuter ending. So we'd say iactum est. And it also says that sometimes the participle simply agrees with the nearest subject if it has multiple subjects. So we might say the table and the temple were seen. So in Latin, table, mensa, is feminine, and temple, templum, is neuter. And so we might just say mensa et templum visum est. And we would just make the visum, the participle, agree with the nearest subject. So we have an example here. It says, as Coptus is in the following sentence. Orgetorigus, filia atque unus e filiis Coptus est. So the subjects of the sentence, the first one is filia, the daughter. Orgetorigus describes the daughter, right? It's the daughter of Orgetorix. That's genitive singular. That's one subject, filia. And then the other subject is one of the sons. Unus is the nominative word. And then a filiis, you'd say one out of the sons or one of the sons. So the daughter of Orgetorix and one of the sons. And then if you look at your verb, Coptus est, you would translate that as were captured because we're talking about two subjects, but it just agrees with the noun that's closest to it in the sentence, which is unus. So unus e filiis, one of the sons, so it's masculine, and that is why Coptus ends with us instead of an a if it was agreeing with filia, or it could end with an I, Copti, sunt, they were taken, if you were going to treat this as a co-ed group and just make it masculine. So there's a couple different ways that you can do this, but at least this book sort of explains all the possible ways. So when you come across a sentence like this, it's not shocking to see coptus instead of copti, since it's agreeing with the subject closest to it. Okay, moving on to section 286. This section is titled Principal Parts in the Passive Voice. And all this section is doing is explaining how to put each principal part into the passive voice. So you see the principal parts usually in a dictionary entry. So for example, the dictionary entry for to praise is laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatum. And all this section is explaining is how do we make each of those principal parts passive? So it says the principal parts of a verb in the passive voice are the present indicative, present infinitive, and perfect indicative. So laudo becomes laudor, laudare becomes laudari. We cannot put laudavi, the third principal part, into the passive voice because the third principal part is only ever used for the active voice. And then the fourth principal part, laudatum, becomes laudatus sum. So it asks us to change all the principal parts for some other example verbs into the passive. So our next example is using the word eubeo, which means to order. Our principal parts are eubeo, eubere, eusi, eusum. So in order to turn that first principal part passive, eubeo is going to add an R to the end, and that is going to become eubeor. So eubeo means I order, and eubeor means I am ordered. The second principal part is our infinitive, that's eubere, and in order to change that to the passive voice, you are going to change that last E to an I, so that's going to become euberi. So to order, eubere, becomes to be ordered, euberi. The third principal part, eusi, you cannot change to the passive voice because you cannot use the third principal part in the passive voice. And then the fourth principal part, eusum, you would just change to eusus sum, turning that fourth principal part into the first person singular perfect passive indicative verb. So hopefully you will notice by now that a lot of the principal parts are first person singular verbs. So the first principal part is the first person singular present active indicative. The third principal part is the first person singular perfect active indicative. And in this exercise, since we are turning the principal parts passive, we are actually turning the fourth principal part into the first person singular perfect passive indicative. Our next example is duco, to lead, and the principal parts are duco, ducere, duxi, ductum. So in order to turn these principal parts passive, duco is going to become ducor. So I lead becomes I am led, or I am being led. Ducere, now this is where it gets a little tricky. For the other two examples I've given so far, in order to turn the present active infinitive into the passive voice, all you have to do is change that last E to an I. So laudare became laudari, and eubere became euberi. And that is true for the first and second and fourth conjugations. But for the third conjugation, passive infinitives look a little different. So instead of just changing that last E to an I, in the third and third IO conjugations, you are actually going to chop off the ERE completely and replace it with an I. So ducere becomes duki. So ducere means to lead, and duki means to be led. Remember, you cannot use the third principal part for the passive voice in any way, so we cannot change duxi to the passive. And then the fourth principal part, ductum, we are going to change to ductus sum, which means I was led, or I have been led. Our next example is yakio, which comes from yakio, yakere, yaki, yaktum, to throw. So yakio is the active form. It means I throw. And to turn it passive, we are going to add that first person singular passive ending, are, to change it to yakior, I am thrown. And you'll notice that this is a third IO verb. The first principal part ends in IO, but the second principal part ends in ERE. So it's third conjugation, but it's sort of the special type of third conjugation. We call it third IO. And so the infinitive is going to behave the same way as I just talked about with duco. So in order to turn yakere to the passive voice, to change to throw into to be thrown, you are going to chop off the entire ERE and replace it with an I. So yakere becomes yaki. Then we can't do anything with yaki because it's a third principal part. And the fourth principal part, yaktum, we are going to change to yaktus sum, I have been thrown, or I was thrown. So again, section 286 is sort of just a little exercise that gets you used to seeing principal parts in both the passive and the active. So usually they're in the active, but we were changing them to the passive. And again, this is just sort of an exercise. You're never going to see specifically laudor, laudari, laudatus sum in a dictionary entry. But I think the reason the book has you do this is because there are verbs that look passive and you actually translate them active. They're called deponent verbs, and they might show up soon. And so this is sort of getting you used to seeing a set of principal parts that looks passive. So, what does the first person singular present passive indicative look like? That's the first principal part. Well, here you're seeing laudor instead of laudo. It's getting you used to seeing that first person singular present passive indicative, then the present passive infinitive, then the perfect passive first person singular indicative forms all in a row. Okay, section 287 is just a little bit of a review. It is just to remind you, here are all of the endings we've learned so far. And it sorts it by, the left column is by tense. So we have our 6 tenses, present, imperfect, future, perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect. And then the columns are active and passive. And this chart actually only has the first person singular, so it's only useful in as far as you can remember the rest of the endings. So this might be helpful to just jog your memory. So for the present active, it starts with O, so those endings go ost, moose, tis, nt. The imperfect active starts with bom, goes bom, bos, bot, bomus, botus, bont. The future active, remember we have 2 sets. For the first and second conjugation, the endings are bo, bis, bit, bimus, bitus, bunt. And for the third and fourth conjugation, the endings are am, es, et, emus, etus, ent. And that whole chunk that I just talked about, the present, imperfect, and future active, all use the second principal part. Then we move on to the bottom half of the active column, and that all uses the third principal part. So the perfect tense endings are isti, it, imus, istis, erunt. The pluperfect active endings are eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratus, erant. And the future perfect active endings are ero, eris, erit, erimus, eritus, erint. Then in the far right column, we have the passive voice. So the present passive endings are ar, ris, ter, mer, mini, nter. And then the imperfect passive endings are bar, baris, bater, bomber, bomini, bonter. And the way I like to explain this to my students is that you don't actually have to memorize every single set of these endings on their own. If you have the first column memorized, all you really have to memorize in the sort of present passive corner of this chart are the present passive endings. So if you can remember ar, ris, ter, mer, mini, nter, and then you can remember that the imperfect uses ba, you don't have to memorize bar, baris, bater as its own set of endings. You can just remember the present passive endings tack onto the ba to make them imperfect. Same thing with future. So if you already can remember bo bis bit, bimus bitus bunt, then you just remember that for the passive voice, you use aris ter, and so it becomes bor, beris bitter, bimmer, bimini, bunter. And that's the one thing that's a little tricky is in the future passive, you would expect it to be B-I-R-I-S, but it actually becomes B-E-R-I-S. And I think that that is sort of self-explanatory in terms of the way it's pronounced. So it's kind of hard to pronounce biris. And if you say biris enough times, it ends up being beris anyway. That's at least a way you can think about why it is beris instead of biris in the second person singular future passive indicative. And then same thing for the other set of future endings. So if you can remember that the third and fourth conjugations use es, et, emus, etis, ent for the future tense, then in the passive, all you have to do is apply the passive personal endings instead of the active, so it becomes ar, eris, eter, emer, emini, enter. And then for the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect passive, you're going to use the fourth principal part, and this is the stuff we talked about today. So the fourth principal part ending in us or whatever ending agrees with the subject. And then for the perfect, you'll use sum, es, est, sumus, estis, sunt. For the pluperfect, you'll use eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratus, erant. And for the future perfect, you'll use ero, eris, erit, erimus, eritus, erunt. So again, this chart does not have all the information you need on it, but if it helps jog your memory, it's a great little tool to have. Moving on to section 288, we have just a couple new vocabulary words, not very many. So our first new vocabulary word is nuper, which is an adverb that means recently. Next, we have indicium, indicii, which is a neuter noun that means information. And there's a couple different ways you can use this noun. So it tells us in the parentheses dico, and what that's telling us is that it is related to the word dico, which means to say. So indicium is something that's told to you, something that is said to you, it's information. And then it tells us that per indicium is an idiom or a phrase that literally translated would mean through information, but here it's telling us that the phrase per indicium in Latin usually means through an informer. Okay, next up is section 289, which is some translation practice. And we start out with a couple examples that are just straight perfect system passive verbs. So some examples from the information we learned at the beginning of this lesson. So just to jog our memory, the verb mitto, mittere, misi, misum means to send. So number one, misus ero. So this comes from, like I just said, the verb to send, and ero is first person singular, since it ends in o. Ero on its own is the first person singular future form of to be, but alongside a fourth principal part, that's going to make this a future perfect passive indicative verb. So it's first person singular, so altogether we would translate this as I will have been sent. So I, because it's first person singular, will have, since it's future perfect, been, since it's passive, and misus is sent. So I will have been sent. Number two, misi eritis. That comes from the same verb, and it's actually exactly the same as the last one, except for instead of being first person singular, it's second person plural. It ends in tis. So we would translate this as y'all will have been sent. And notice that the fourth principal part here, that first word in the verb, ends in I instead of a us because it's agreeing with that plural subject. So y'all will have been sent. Y'all is plural, so the adjectival ending of the participle needs to be plural as well. Number three, misi estis. Now this looks pretty similar to the last one, but estis is a form of the present tense to be. sum est, sumus estis sunt. So that means that this is a perfect passive verb. So we would translate this as y'all were sent, or y'all have been sent. Number 4, misi eratis. Again, this looks pretty similar to the last one, except for eratis comes from eram, eras, erat, which is on its own the imperfect form of to be, but with a fourth principal part of another verb, that makes a pluperfect passive verb. So we would translate this as y'all had been sent. Number 5, ad Galliam missus eram. So let's take a look first at our verb. Now, usually when we look at a sentence, one of the first things we want to look for is the subject, but I don't see anything that's obviously nominative in this sentence, so let's start with our verb to be on the safe side. Missus eram is our verb, and since eram on its own is the imperfect form of to be, next to a fourth principal part, that's going to turn missus eram into a pluperfect passive verb. So missus eram, eram is first person singular, so we would translate that as I had been sent, and the rest of the sentence is a prepositional phrase. So ad means to or towards, and Galliam is our accusative object of that preposition ad. So altogether we would say I had been sent to Gaul. Number 6, pax confirmata erit. So we can start with what is pretty clearly the subject here, which is pax, and it's clearly the subject because it is a nominative singular noun. So pax means peace. And what's happening to the peace? The verb is confirmata erit. Now, confirmare can mean a lot of different things. It can mean confirm, or build up, or decided on, or declare. I think here it makes the most sense to translate it as declared. So confirmata erit, erit on its own would be a future form of to be. Here, along with a fourth principal part, it's going to be a future perfect passive verb. So we would translate this as peace will have been declared, or peace will have been confirmed. Number 7, duae legiones conscriptae erunt. So let's start off with our subject. Duae legiones are both nominative plural feminine nouns. And just in case we weren't totally sure that they were the subject, we can look at our verb and we see that it's a plural verb, so it needs a plural subject. And the participial ending of conscripti, the first word of our verb, even agrees with the feminine plural legiones and duae. So we know that duae and legiones are the subject. So duae means two, and legiones are legions, groups of soldiers. So 2 legions, and then our verb is conscriptae erunt. Now, erunt on its own is a future form of to be, so along with a perfect passive participle, that's going to turn that into a future perfect passive verb. So we would translate this as 2 legions will have been conscripted. And conscripti can mean conscript or to draft. So 2 legions will have been conscripted, or 2 legions will have been drafted. Number 8, nuntiatum est. Nuntiatum is the fourth principal part of the verb nuntio, nuntiare, nuntiavi, nuntiatum, which means to announce. So since est is a present form of to be, along with the fourth principal part, that's going to make this a perfect passive verb. So we would translate this as it has been announced, or it was announced. Now, you might ask, why did I know that the subject is it and not he or she? And the answer is, look at the ending of the fourth principal part. Look at the ending of nuntiatum. That is neuter. And so when you have a neuter ending and nothing else in the sentence that indicates exactly what the subject is, you're going to make the subject it. So if we wanted to say he was announced, we would have to say nuntiatus est. And if we wanted to say she has been announced, we would say nuntiata est. Number 9, appellati sunt. So appellati is the fourth principal part of appello, appellare, appellavi, appellatum, which means to call. And sunt is a third person plural on its own form of the present tense of to be, but since it's with a fourth principal part, this is a perfect passive verb. So we would make the subject they, since it's third person plural, and we'd say they were called or they have been called. And one interesting thing about this is even though it's a little tricky to include it in our translation, we actually know that the they are women because appellati ends in ae, and that's a feminine plural ending. So whoever was called must be a group of women. Number 10, pila importata erant. Now, if you've spent a lot of time with Latin vocabulary, this one actually might be a little confusing because pila on its own can mean two different things. Pila pili, the first declension feminine singular noun, means ball, but pilum pili, the second declension neuter noun, means javelin or spear. And we can actually figure out which one it is here because the verb is plural, and pila is clearly the subject of this plural verb, and the only time you have an a as your plural nominative ending is for a neuter noun. So this must mean javelin or spear. Since it's plural, we're going to say the javelins or the spears. And then what's happening to the spears? Importata erant. So importata comes from importo, which means to carry in. We get the word import from it. And since the second word in this verb is erant, an imperfect form of to be, this must be a pluperfect passive verb. So we would translate this as the javelins had been carried in, or the javelins had been imported. Number 11, ab hostibus capti erimus. So looking at this sentence, we do not have a clear subject in the nominative case, so we can look at our verb, and we see that our verb is first person plural, erimus. So the subject is going to be we, and we don't need another word in the sentence to say we. It's included in the verb. So capti erimus, erimus is a form of the future tense of to be, along with the fourth principal part of capio capere, capi captum. That's going to be a future perfect passive verb, and we would translate that as we will have been captured, or we will have been seized. And the rest of the sentence is a prepositional phrase, ab hostibus. So ab along with a passive verb is going to mean by, and the object of ab is the ablative plural noun hostibus, which means enemy. So all together we would say, we will have been captured by the enemies. And in this sentence, we is the subject, but we are not doing the action because it's a passive verb. Who's doing the action? It's the enemies. The enemies are the ones who are capturing, so they can't be the subject because it's a passive verb, so we call them the agent. Hostibus is in the ablative case, so we call that an ablative of agent. Anytime we have a passive verb, if you want to explain who's doing the action, you're going to need an ablative of agent to tell you that information. Next is number 12. A milite visus eris. So looking at this once again, it's pretty clear that the subject is included within the verb. Visus eris is second person singular, so the subject's going to be you, and the rest of the sentence is a prepositional phrase. So let's start with the verb, visus eris. Eris on its own would mean you will be. It's a future form of the verb to be. But alongside this fourth principal part, this perfect passive participle form of video, videre, vidi, visum, it's going to be a future perfect passive verb. So we would translate this as you will have been seen. And then the rest of the sentence is going to tell us the agent who's doing the seeing. So you will have been seen. A is our preposition that means by, and then the object is milite, which comes from miles militis, which means soldier. So all together, you will have been seen by the soldier. Now, this is sort of an interesting one because the passive form of videre can actually be translated in two pretty different ways. So anytime you see a passive form of videre, you could translate it as be seen. Right here we said you will have been seen. But once in a while, and actually pretty often once you're reading like quote unquote real Latin, once you're reading full sections of Caesar or full sections of Cicero, you're actually going to translate videre in the passive as seem with an M. So instead of saying you will have been seen, you would actually translate this as you will have seemed. But that's not what's going on here, and I think that's a little advanced for what we're doing so far, since you're just starting to learn the passive voice to begin with. So don't worry about that too much, but just keep in mind that at some point in the future, it might come up that the passive form of videre can actually be translated in sort of an active way that's different than what you would expect. Number 13, id Caesari nuntiatum erat. So looking at all the different pieces of this sentence, we should look for a subject, and the subject is going to be id. That is a neuter nominative singular form of the pronoun is, ea, id, which means he, she, or it. And here, id, since it's neuter, it means it. And just in case we weren't totally sure that it is the subject, if you look at the verb, nuntiatum erat, the first word of the verb, nuntiatum, ends in um, and that is the neuter nominative singular ending. So we know that the subject is neuter nominative singular, so it's going to be it. Then we can look at the verb. Erat is our second word. On its own, that is an imperfect form of to be. So alongside this perfect passive participle of the verb to announce, nuntiare, that becomes together a pluperfect passive verb. So far we would translate this as it had been announced. So it, because it is the third person singular subject, and id is the subject. Had, since it's pluperfect. Been, since it's passive, and nuntiare means announce. So it had been announced. Now, how are we going to translate Caesari? Caesar is a third declension noun, which means Caesar, right? It is the name Caesar, but remember in Latin, even names decline. And the letter I in the third declension is dative singular. So we translate the dative case using the English words to or for. So it would make the most sense to translate this as it had been announced to Caesar. Number 14, ea conjuratio helvetiis per indicium est a nuntiata. So let's start with our subject, ea conjuratio. So both of these are nominative singular feminine. Conjuratio is a noun that means conspiracy, and ea on its own can mean he, she, or it, but when it's agreeing with another noun, it means either this or that. It sort of stands in place for hic haec hoc or ilea lud or iste ista stud. So here we could translate this as this conspiracy or that conspiracy. Sometimes ise id is translated as sort of an emphatic the. So you could say the conspiracy. It's not just any conspiracy, it's the conspiracy. This conspiracy that I'm talking about. All right, what happened to the conspiracy? Let's look at our verb. So at the end of this sentence, we see est and we see enuntiata. Now, on its own, est is the third person singular, present active indicative of to be. It means he, she, or it is. But enuntiata is the fourth principal part of enuntiare, which means to announce. And so even though you usually have the form of to be after the perfect passive participle, we are going to assume that est enuntiata is a verb phrase together. So you would usually expect this to be enuntiata est, and here they've just switched the order. And this is helpful to remember that Latin word order is not super regular. So there are some parts of Latin word order that we do see often. So usually the subject is near the beginning of the sentence. Usually the verb is near the end. But in situations like this, sometimes the second word can come first. So sometimes it can be est enuntiata instead of enuntiata est. So this is going to be a perfect passive verb that translates to was announced. So far we have that conspiracy or this conspiracy was announced. And then helvetiis is a dative plural form of the noun for the Helvetians. So we can translate that as to or for, and since we're announcing something, it makes more sense to say to. So this conspiracy was announced to the Helvetians. And then we have this phrase per indicium, which we would assume means through information, but remember our glossary told us to translate per indicium as through an informer. So altogether, this translates to, this conspiracy was announced to the Helvetians through an informer. Next is number 15. Pater caustici a populo Romano amicus appellatus erat. So if we look through this whole sentence, we could really start with pater. That is only ever going to be nominative singular, so it must be our subject. So pater comes from the noun pater patris, which means father. So the father. And then the next word is caustici, which is a genitive singular form of a name, causticus. And since it's right after pater, that makes sense that it's genitive singular. It is possessive. So we could say causticus's father or the father of causticus. So the father of causticus is the subject of the sentence. Then let's skip down to our verb. And once again, we have a two-word pluperfect passive verb. And we know it's pluperfect because the second word is erat. So appellatus erat comes from the verb appello, appellare, appellavi, appellatum, which means to call. So it's third person singular, which makes sense because the subject was a third person singular subject, the father. And we are going to translate this as had been called. So had because it's pluperfect and been because it's passive. So the father of causticus had been called. And then the next word in Latin is actually also nominative. So you can think of this sort of like a predicate nominative with a verb to be. So in Latin, you would say X is called Y, and X and Y would both be in the nominative case. So here, our other nominative word is amicus, which means friend. So the father of causticus had been called a friend. And then the rest of the sentence is this prepositional phrase, a populo Romano. So a means by, which makes sense because we usually have an a or ab alongside a passive verb to indicate the agent or who is doing the action in the sentence. And then the object of a is populo Romano, which means Roman people. And it's ablative because a takes an ablative object. So altogether we have the father of causticus had been called a friend by the Roman people. Number 16. Inter fines Helvetiorum et Allobrogum, qui nuper pacati errant, Rhodanus fluit. So here we have a couple Caesar-specific words. These are all words about the Gallic region. So let's start with our main sentence. So we are going to ignore at the beginning the relative clause qui nuper pacati errant and just do the rest of the sentence. So inter fines Helvetiorum et Allobrogum, Rhodanus fluit. So inter fines is a prepositional phrase. Inter means between, and then fines is the Latin word for borders. So between the borders, and then we have two Gallic tribe names in the genitive plural case. So we have the Helvetiorum, the Helvetians, and the Allobrogum, the Allobrogi. So remember, you translate the genitive with the word of. So altogether, so far, we have between the borders of the Helvetians and the Allobrogi. What happens? That's just a prepositional phrase. We don't have a main sentence yet. We don't have a subject or a verb. Well, our subject and our verb are at the end, Rhodanus fluit. So something happens between the borders of the Helvetian and the Allobrogi. And what happens is the Rhodanus, which is a river, fluit. And fluit comes from the Latin verb fluo, fluere, which means to flow. So the Rhodanus River flows. But we have more information we need to stick in here. And this is information about the Gallic tribes. And we know this because a couple reasons. When we look at the relative clause, qui nuper pacati errant, the relative pronoun qui is going to agree with its antecedent, the thing that it's describing, in gender and number. So qui is nominative plural masculine, and if we look through the rest of the sentence, the masculine plural thing that makes the most sense to be described by this relative clause are these tribes, the Helvetians and the Allobrogi. So we can translate the qui as who. So between the borders of the Helvetians and the Allobrogi, who, and then what happened to them? Pacati errant. We have another compound verb here, a pluperfect passive verb, and again, we know it's pluperfect instead of any other tense because the second word is errant, a form of to be in the imperfect tense. Pacati comes from the Latin verb which means to pacify. It's related to the noun pax pacus, which means peace. So literally to be made peaceful, but in ancient Rome, when you are saying that you make something or someone peaceful, it really means that you conquer it. So you are making it peaceful by force. So who had been pacified, and then nuper is an adverb that means recently. So altogether we have between the borders of the Helvetians and the Allobrogi, who had been pacified recently, the Rhodanus River flows. Number 17. Gallia sub septentrionibus ut ante dictum est posita est. So our subject here is Gallia, which just means Gaul, and then we can skip all the way to the end for our main verb, which is posita est. So posita comes from the Latin word which means to put or place, pono, ponere, posui, positum. And since the second word in this two-word verb is a present tense form of to be, est, that means that together these two words make a perfect passive verb. So we would translate this as Gaul was placed or Gaul has been placed. Next, we have a prepositional phrase, sub septentrionibus. Septentrionibus actually refers to the constellations, the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper, but it is also a more general term for north. Subseptentrionibus literally means under the Little Dipper, or under the Dipper constellations, but we can translate this as in the north. So Gallia, or Gaul, was placed in the north. And then we have this little phrase, ut ante dictum est. We actually have a footnote here that explains how we should translate ut. It says at the bottom of the page, ut with the indicative generally means as. So you may see ut later on meaning a lot of different things, but right now we can translate it as because dictum est is indicative. So as dictum est. Now let's look at the ending of this fourth principal part, this perfect passive participle. We don't have a subject in this subordinate clause, but the um tells us that the subject, or what we should translate as the subject, is neuter singular. So we could translate this with the subject it. Dictum comes from dico, dicere, dixi, dictum, which means to say. And since est, just like posita est, dictum est is also a perfect passive verb, since est is a present tense form of to be, and along with a perfect passive participle, that creates a perfect passive verb. So we could translate this as it was said, or as it has been said, and then ante means before. So all together, this sentence says, Gaul was placed in the north, as it has been said before. Number 18, Caesaris copiae prope hostium castra visae erant. So looking through this sentence, you might see a couple different words that could be nominative, that could be your subject. So let's look at our verb first to figure out what actually is our subject. So our verb is at the end. Once again, we have a two-word perfect system passive verb, visae erant. And since erant is the imperfect form of to be, that's going to make visae erant a pluperfect verb. And if we look at the ending of the fourth principal part that we're using, visae, we know that our subject is going to be feminine plural. And if you look at the rest of the sentence, you actually can see not only a feminine plural word, but a word that actually has the same endings, because it's also first declension. So copiae is going to be our subject. Now, copia can actually mean a couple different things, but generally in the plural, we translate it as troops. And that makes sense here because we're talking about Caesar, we're talking about enemy camps, so it's already military language, so it makes sense that copiae are indeed troops. So the troops, and then Caesaris is going to go with copiae. Caesaris is the genitive singular form of the name Caesar, so we would translate that as the troops of Caesar. And then we can skip to our verb, visae erant, which I mentioned before, is pluperfect and comes from the Latin word for to see, video, videre, vidi, visum. So the troops of Caesar, or Caesar's troops, had been seen. And where had they been seen? Our prepositional phrase tells us, prope hostium castra. Now, prope is our preposition, and that means near, and prope takes an accusative. So if we look at the two words that are left, hostium is a third declension noun. So even though it ends in um, and for some declensions that is an accusative ending, hostium is not going to be the object of your preposition. So let's keep going. Castra. Castra is a neuter plural noun that we actually translate in the singular as camp. So near the camp, and then hostium, since it's third declension, that ending is genitive plural. So near the camp of the enemy, or near the enemy's camps. So altogether, Caesar's troops had been seen near the enemy's camp. Number 19, agris vastatis Civitas arma tradidit. So here we take a little break. It looks like we take a little break for the rest of the exercises from our 2-word perfect system passive verbs. So sort of going back to some things we've already talked about. Just doing a little review now. So agris vastatis has a couple things about it that should set off sort of warning bells in our heads that this is an ablative absolute. So our very first sign that this is an ablative absolute is that the 2 words are ablative. But there are a couple other signs, namely that it is set off by commas and that it's a noun and a participle. So remember that an ablative absolute is a standalone phrase that is entirely in the ablative case, unless it has sort of other components within it, like a prepositional phrase describing the ablative phrase. But in its most basic form, it is a phrase in the ablative case that stands alone. And we call it an ablative absolute because it is absolute. It works as a unit on its own. And an ablative absolute usually has a noun and a participle. Once in a while, it doesn't even need a participle. You can sort of imply a sort of to be participle, so like with the noun existing. But here we have an actual participle, and you're going to translate it as with the noun verbing or with the noun having been verbed, depending on what kind of participle it is. So here we have agris, which is the Latin word for field. And then we have vastatis, which comes from the Latin verb vastare, which means to destroy or to lay waste to, something like that. So we are going to translate this ablative absolute as with the fields having been destroyed, because vastatis is a perfect passive participle, because it comes from the 4th principal part. So with the fields having been destroyed. And then remember that the ablative absolute is not the subject of your sentence, it sort of stands alone. So it gives us more information about the sentence, but now we need our main sentence. We need a subject and we need a verb. And looking at the rest of the sentence, civitas is a nominative singular noun, so that must be our subject. Civitas means state, but it's talking about the citizens. It's talking about the people that make up the state. So we could say the state or we could say the citizens. So with the fields having been destroyed, the state tradidit, that is a 3rd person singular, perfect, active, indicative verb. It's a form of tradere, which means to hand over. So the state handed over, and then arma is our neuter plural accusative direct object, which means arms or weapons. So with the fields having been destroyed, the state handed over its weapons. Number 20, yakiet. So this is just a simple verb practice. Looking at our ending, it ends in T, so that means it is a 3rd person singular verb. So we could make our subject he, she, or it. Then let's remember that yakiet comes from yakio, yakere, yaki, yaktum, which means to throw. And yakio is a 3rd IO verb. It's 3rd conjugation, but it's sort of the special type of 3rd conjugation that has a 1st principal part that ends in IO. So remember that in the future tense, the endings differ based on conjugation. So 1st and 2nd conjugation verbs have bo, bis, bit as their future tense endings, but 3rd and 4th conjugation verbs have am, s, et as their future tense endings. So that means that this verb is future. So altogether, we would translate it as he will throw, or she will throw, or it will throw. We don't have the context to know who the subject is, so we can just pick one. Number 21, viderat, viderit. So this sentence is sort of calling attention to the differences between different tenses of the same verb. So this comes from the verb video, videre, vidi, visum. And looking at our endings, the first verb has the ending erat, so that must be pluperfect. And the second verb has the ending erit, and that is future perfect. Both of them are third person singular because they end in T. So let's make he our subject. So the first verb would be he had seen, and the second verb would be he will have seen. So altogether, viderat, viderit means he had seen, he will have seen. Number 22, videns. So we're still working with videre, which means to see. And when you take an infinitive, videre, and you chop off the re and then add ns, that is a present active participle. So remember that present active participles behave like third declension adjectives. So videns is the nominative singular form. If you wanted to make it a different case, you would have to use nt and then a third declension ending. So videns means seeing. And even though there's no context, we know that this is nominative singular because it ends in ns. So if this was in a more complicated sentence, videns would describe the subject. But no matter what, it means seeing because it's a present active participle. Number 23, videndi causa. So the Latin word causa on its own means cause or reason, but oftentimes it is translated a very specific way when it's in the ablative and when it is accompanied by a genitive word. So we are going to translate causa in the ablative, and you know it's in the ablative because it has a macron over the A, as for the sake of. And we are going to use that of translating the genitive word. So for the sake of blank. And videndi is our genitive singular word, and videndi is a gerund. So in the last exercise, I talked about for present active participles, you chop off the re of the infinitive and you add ns or nt. For gerunds, which are verbal nouns, verbs that act like nouns, you chop off the re and you add nd and then an ending. So you're going to translate this as for the sake of seeing. Number 24, paratus ad videnda castra. This is not actually a sentence because it does not have a main verb. So this is a phrase. So we are going to translate this as a sentence fragment, but just know that there is not a main verb in this sentence. So let's start with the first word, paratus. That comes from the Latin verb paro, parare, paravi, paratum, which means to prepare. And it is a form of the fourth principal part, a perfect passive participle. So we can translate this as having been prepared, or we can translate it as simply prepared. And then the rest of the sentence is a prepositional phrase of sorts with the preposition ad. Now, the preposition ad can mean to or towards, but along with a gerundive, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a second, it can also mean for the purpose of, which makes sense because you are prepared for the purpose of doing something. So we could actually just translate this as to, so prepared to do something. Now, our gerundive here is videnda. So remember that gerundives are verbs that act like adjectives. They are a type of participle, but they are always passive in voice, and they usually have a sense of urgency to them. You should do something, or more accurately, something should be done or something must be done, which actually fits well into the meaning of the sentence so far. So prepared to do something. Videnda comes from videre, to see. So prepared for something to be seen. Remember that videnda is a gerundive, and gerundives are passive. And what is going to be seen? The castra, the camp. So literally, we should translate this sentence as prepared for the purpose of the camp to be seen. But that sounds terrible in English. That is not the way you would say that in English at all. So a trick we usually use with gerundives is you actually translate them active. So you need to remember that grammatically they are passive, but it sounds awkward to say it in English. So instead of saying, for the purpose of the camp being seen, we can say, to see the camp. So that is the end of lesson 35. So just a brief review. The things that we talked about in this lesson were learning about the perfect system passive indicative verbs. So that's 3 tenses of passive verbs: perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect. And those are the verbs where you use 2 words to make the verb, the first word being a form of the fourth principal part, and the second word being a form of to be. We talked about making sure that the form of the fourth principal part, that perfect passive participle, agrees with the subject, so making sure it has the appropriate ending. We also did a brief exercise changing the principal parts of a verb from active to passive. We looked at a table of indicative endings that sort of has a brief run-through of all the different verb endings you've learned so far. Of course, the table only has the first person singular, so it only has about 1/6 of the information you really need, but it is a helpful table to jog your memory. And we had a couple new vocab words, and we did some translation practice. Thank you so much for having me as your guest teacher. I had a lot of fun with this. Next up is lesson 36, where you will learn about comparison of adjectives.